This is an extract from the Leader podcast by the Evening Standard. The whole thing is available on all major podcast providers.
The founder of revolutionary charity Teach First has issued a stark warning. The coronavirus pandemic risks creating a so-called educational underclass in London. Brett Wigdortz says years of work to improve the life chances of the capital's most disadvantaged children risks backsliding after students were forced to learn from home and those from more advantaged backgrounds are finding it easier to recover from lost time. Our editorial column says he's right to raise the alarm.
Many pupils are still missing lessons as class bubbles are sent home after a positive test. The response must be a redoubling of the government's efforts to help children catch up, and a focus on ensuring that the $1 billion that has been allocated to do this is used predominantly to help the most disadvantaged children. Additional investment should be provided too, if evidence emerges that disadvantaged children are suffering from further missed classes. The pandemic must not be allowed to blight permanently any child's future.
The Standard's education editor Anna Davis joins me. Anna, what work has Teach First done to narrow the education gap between London's rich and poor pupils?
Brett set up Teach First as a way of training new teachers and sort of parachuting them into the poorest schools. So he got top graduates who were leaving Oxford and Cambridge, who were probably going to go on to become lawyers or city workers, to commit to working for a couple of years in teaching in deprived schools before they went on with their careers. That was the idea back in 2002. And it grew into such a massive teacher training organisation that it's become one of the biggest graduate recruiters in the country. And it's been really successful at getting sort of bright and enthusiastic, talented young graduates to work in inner city and deprived schools. Many have gone on to then stay in teaching and not just do it as a teach first and then going on to other careers. So it's a different way of training, and it's a way of getting people into poorer schools. It was really successful, and then he left 3 years ago, but he continues to be a big name in education. So the idea was to help poorer children. That was the initial idea, with inspirational teachers who would go and bring sort of fresh blood into these schools and inspire them.
So how has the pandemic affected the work Teach First has done up to this point?
I mean, the main problem is many children were just not able to work during those 6 months that they were off school for. So while they're at school, whatever background they're from can be overcome because, schools do so much to level people up, and give everybody the same opportunities. But then when they were sent home for 6 months, many don't have a bedroom to work in or a quiet space to work in, a computer or access to the internet. So they found it very difficult to work and keep up. But then their sort of more privileged peers who did have access to all those things could continue to excel, which is why the gap has widened between those children from different types of backgrounds. And that's what Brett's really worried about, is that, the pandemic has just widened this problem that was, it seemed we were getting it under control, and many things had helped reduce that gap. And if nothing is done now, he worries that we're just going to go backwards. And if you're from a poorer background, you're not going to do as well at school, which is just unfair.
Mr. Wigdortz mentions London has been a world leader in educational improvements, but now, as you say, is really worried of a backslide that will create what he terms a permanent educational underclass. What exactly does that mean?
London, maybe 15 years ago, was not seen as a great place to educate your children. But due to a number of initiatives, including Teach First and something called London Challenge, which was launched by the then Labour government to boost results in London, have actually really worked. And I've written so many times over the last few years, that the results in London are outshining those elsewhere in the country. Children, especially if you're from a poor background, do much better in London schools than they would do elsewhere. And that's from a combination of all those different things. And that's why he's saying, when he travels the world as an education expert, people really look to London as a success story. But it's this problem with children being sent home throughout the pandemic that he thinks is going to cause things to go backwards, because those children were sent home without access to education. Some of them, they weren't able to do the work, and that's what he thinks, could create this educational underclass of children who, start off from poor backgrounds, and the school doesn't help them to get out of those backgrounds because they didn't have access to all the education that they missed out on throughout the pandemic.
Did he give you a sense of how difficult it might be to reverse the impact the pandemic could have?
He was not unoptimistic. I don't think it's insurmountable. Some of the things that the government has done, he said, haven't gone far enough. So, for example, GCSE and A-levels are being put back by 3 weeks to allow extra teaching time, so pupils can try and catch up on some of that work that they missed. He doesn't think that's gone far enough, and other things need to be done. Some head teachers have said pupils need to be given special consideration for their exam results this year if they haven't been able to work properly during the pandemic. But the main thing he's concerned about, and other head teachers, is that schools don't close again. Keeping schools open is key now, because when they're in school, they can learn and they can catch up on all the stuff they missed, and they're equal, whatever background they're from. But if you shut schools again and they go home, without access to the laptops and things like that, then that's where the problems will continue.